What's going on, Endless fans? Will Curran from Endless Events back here again for another Whiteboard Wednesday. And today we're talking about how a long day can turn into an expensive bill, especially an expensive AV labor bill. So we really want to talk about this because there's a couple rules that we get clarification and a lot of questions about. And you know what? Figured it could use its own video as well. So what we want to talk about when it comes to labor is everything usually revolves around a day. A day is about 10 hours of work. A half day, half of that, 5 hours of work. Obviously, this depends from company to company. Sometimes you'll hear a full day being 8 hours, sometimes it'll be 4 hours. When I talk about some of these rules, these are the ways that Endless has it set up. Every company is going to be totally different in how it charges and how it follows these rules. But what we found across the entire world is that most companies follow these rules pretty straightforwardly. And usually when it comes down to it, the best companies usually all have about the same rules because they want to protect their employees in the same way. So something to keep in mind as you go through this, these are just a couple rules when you're planning out your event and planning out your schedule. So keep in mind when you're planning out your schedule and where you put breaks and things like that, this can majorly affect the AV company across the entire board. So let's jump right on in. So let's take this example day that we have over here on the right hand side. So the way to kind of keep in mind as you're thinking about it is actually, let's plan on having this day start about 7 a.m. actually. Instead of 8 a.m., let's actually have it start around 7 a.m. Reason why is just to keep us really simple with numbers. After about 5 hours, you end up at about noon when it comes down to it. The reason why I have this set up this way, starting at 7 a.m. and ending about noon for lunch, is that after about 5 hours of work, most AV labor and most technicians and engineers are going to need a break. There's sometimes little smaller breaks, like 15-minute breaks placed inside there, for them to go grab their coffee and stretch and everything. But usually we'll call it the lunch break, is that after about 5 hours, they're going to need a lunch break or a meal break. And you might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, what happens if this is in the middle of my event? Again, this is why you want to set up your schedule to match this as best possible. So when it comes down to it, 5 hours, after 5 hours, you're going to need a break. And this break has to happen in either two ways. First is that it's called a walk-away break, or what we'll say is a 1 hour walk-away lunch. This means for a solid hour, they need the ability to leave site, go grab lunch, relax, do whatever they want to do for that hour. You can't dictate where they go, how, yada, yada. They can't tell them to work on schedules. Right? They have to be able to get a clean break away for an hour. So something to keep in mind is that always try to schedule within. My best recommendation is try to schedule a 1 hour break in the middle for them to get food, take a break essentially. The other option is a lot of companies will also do what's called a 30-minute lunch provided break. So what this means is that they get 30 minutes to break. However, food has to be provided for them. So basically the idea is that you're saving some time, that extra 30 minutes, instead of them having to go find food, get their lunch set up, whatever it is, it's only 30 minutes. But in this case, I'm going to do this being an hour break. Again, it gives the ability for you to extend into work a little bit later in the day, which we'll get to in just a little bit. So again, two options when it comes to these meal breaks: 1 hour walk away or a 30-minute provided lunch. Everybody with me so far? After 5 hours, give them that break. So then let's say they come back and they're ready to get work done again. They've gotten their 1 hour walk away. Well, then you get another 5 hours worth of work before you're going to need another meal break. So again, after every 5 hours, feed them. Pretty simple, right? We want to feed people. We all have to eat at some point. We want to make sure that we do that. So after about 5 hours, boom, you're going to want to do another break as well. However, to illustrate this the best way possible, I'm going to show you what happens a lot of times. Is let's say, for example, your event starts at 7 a.m. You have really early, like let's say the general session starts at 8 a.m., but 7 a.m. is from 8 a.m. is a rehearsal. Then, you have general session all day long. And then, let's say we give them a lunch break because, our general session is not going to be in action during that time. And then we go back to doing general sessions and it's like a long day, right? We have a lot of meetings, yada, yada. But we then are going to have a late night gala dinner. We're going to have a party, whatever it may be. So we're going to need them to stay past 6 p.m., which again is 5 hours after this. Well then, not only in addition to needing another meal break, you run into what is usually the dreaded overtime. And everyone, wants to avoid this as much as possible. So this is how we're going to recommend that you avoid this. For our company, we do it that after 10 hours, anything from 10 hours to 12 hours, basically in that next section, is what's called overtime. Overtime is 1.5 times rate. So, let's say this normal person is working for $50 an hour. Well, at this point, when they're working for these 2 hours from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., it's in overtime. So they're getting paid $75 an hour. You can see how this can get really expensive very, very fast. Then at our company, we do it after 12 hours of straight work. Anything 12 hours, 13 hours, 14 hours, yada, yada, yada. God forbid it goes any longer. It goes into what's called double time. And this is kind of the progression, right? You get kind of the happy work, you know, and people like to say, like, why would people want this? They just want overtime. To be honest, if you talk to most engineers, they do not want to go to overtime and double time, because this means this is a really long day of work. It means they're like, really, it's getting into late night. I mean, you're talking working until 9 p.m., 10 p.m. Oh my gosh, after they've been here since 7 a.m., no one really wants to work double time. So you're going from this kind of like happy work, well, then things start to get a little fuzzy when you get to this overtime, and you're kind of the warning signs should be blinking. At this point, if you don't have this scheduled and this is starting to happen, hopefully your AV company will warn you and say, hey, just so you know, we're about to go into overtime. We don't want to do that. You know, they'll hopefully warn you. But absolutely, the thing you want to avoid is double time. That is just the worst, and that can be extremely dangerous because you're then paying double the rate. You've gone from paying $50 an hour to paying $100 an hour. And you can see how this can start to increase your bills and everything like that. So when you're planning out your schedule, you want to make sure that you're giving these breaks along the way, but also that you don't plan for these really long days. To be honest, just try to always plan around the engineer working for 10 hours total with a 1 hour break. So from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m., just be done. That's a pretty simple way to avoid it. However, some cases, right, we either have a long gala dinner, or let's say, for example, you need them to stay late for rehearsals. That totally makes sense. Just plan for it when it comes to your labor. And again, all these rules kind of slightly differ between companies. So make sure that you're talking to your AV company about what these rules are before you sign the quote, and that you understand them, because in the case you do have to take it as an emergency, avoid it, right? So, okay, so then what's going to be really interesting that happens, and another labor rule we get a lot of questions about, is that what happens if, let's say, for example, you did all of this, right? And then you pushed and worked until, let's say, for example, 11 p.m. This double time went to 11 p.m. and you were working till 11 p.m. Well, then you want to avoid something called a tight turnaround. And what this has to do is, let's fast forward and go to tomorrow. Let's say, for example, this was the first day, but the next day you have an early morning breakfast with the CEO, and that starts at 6 a.m., so you need all the engineers there at 5 a.m. Short turnaround is what happens whenever the engineers have to finish one work session or work shift, and in less than 8 hours between when they end work and when they start work, it's called a short turnaround. So what this means is, always whenever you're planning your schedule, plan for when the engineers finish their work, you have at least 8 hours between when they start their next shift. The reason why you want to avoid this is when you get into the eternal, horrible day of flames and extremely high costs. The reason why is anything that happens then that next day can lead to pretty much double time all day long. Again, these rules slightly depend on the company, but what I've seen is that the next day it starts, they immediately start in overtime. So what that means is anything that day is going to be already in overtime. Well, what that means is if you end up doing this again, where you go into overtime, it's overtime of overtime. So you're going 1.5 costs times 1.5 costs. Then God forbid you go double time, and it's 1.5 costs times 2 times costs. You can see how this day could be extremely expensive. And the most common way that we see this happen is when you have a long gala dinner, and then you have to be out of the venue and everything has to be torn down the next morning, early morning, because you have to be out by noon, for example. So you want to manufacture your schedule, so then that way, again, you cause a nice big 8-hour break between the 2 days. What's nice is I find with most AV companies, if, for example, the guys end at like 11 p.m., you know, and then the next day would obviously be 7 a.m. would be the start time. Make sure I got that right. No, wait. Yeah, make sure I got that math right. 7 a.m. would be the next start time. They don't factor into things like driving, but that's something to keep in mind with your AV engineers. A lot of them are not going to be at the hotel right across the street. Sometimes they'll be, you know, for example, having to drive an hour to go get home. Obviously, that's the engineer's choice and where they live and things like that, but that's something to keep in mind. We want everyone to get a full 8 hours of sleep, but if you keep in mind factor and drive time and everything like that, it can lead to really horrible times where you're driving for an hour to get home. You only sleep for 5 hours because you have to be up in the morning and then be there in time. Nightmare. Some ways that I've seen avoiding short turnarounds and some more forgiveness around it is that if you know you have to do a short turnaround for some reason, providing hotels on site. So then that way, hey, yeah, you're going to be in short turnaround, but maybe we can avoid those short turnarounds since we're providing you on site to eliminate drive time and travel time and everything like that. We've seen that help as well. So again, just to recap, 5-hour chunks. Make sure you get meal breaks. Make sure, otherwise you're going to get to meal break. There are some penalties related to meal breaks, which are related sometimes to overtime, where if you don't give a meal break, things can be forced into overtime earlier, that sort of stuff. But, after 10 hours, avoid overtime. After 12 hours-ish, avoid double time, and then make sure you give a nice 8-hour break in between your different days and shifts, because then you can get into this horrible day of flames, which I'll call short turnaround all day. So, that's some tips when it comes to labor planning, something for you to be aware of when you are scheduling and creating your schedules for your event, whether, making sure you get a lunch break or, the engineers get break during lunch, that sort of stuff. You're just going to be now more aware of what to do, so then that way you can avoid these additional costs. So I hope you found this helpful. If you did, I would love for you to subscribe down below. And if you really loved it, give it a thumbs up. However, if you didn't like it, give us a thumbs down. And down in the comments, let us know how we can make this event better. Or this video better. Huh, I almost thought this was a whole event. That would have been crazy. So, also, we want to hear from you. What sort of topics do you want us to cover? Leave us a comment down below and let us know what sort of topics you want us to cover, what sort of scenarios you've seen. And the prompt that I have for you today is, what's an example of an event where you had one of these rules broken, and how did it affect your event? Did you have any clever ways that you avoided it? Do you have any tips for other planners for how you schedule out your schedules to avoid things like meal break penalties and overtime and everything like that? We'd love to hear it down in the comments below. Well, that's going to do it for this week's Whiteboard Wednesday. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and we can't wait to see you next week. I'll catch you later, Endless fans.